Hello and welcome to the Social AgTech Podcast by DMTR. I'm Dion and I'm here with my co-host Arian. Now, DMTR is on a mission to help shape a more food-secure future for our planet where nobody has to go hungry. We aim to do this by educating about and learning from those actively working to combat rising world hunger by showcasing some of the brilliant innovators out there making a real difference.
So where does this podcast come in? And to put it very shortly, with this podcast, what we want to do is explore some of the main causes of severe malnutrition and food insecurity, look at new ideas and ways that are being explored to tackle them, and check out innovative solutions that are already making a difference and show how others can be doing the same. And that's really our main aim with this podcast, just explore those ideas, explore those challenges, and really highlight and champion some of the amazing solutions that are out there, and hopefully inspire some others to do the same along the way.
So with that in mind, I'd love to hear exactly what it is that led you to start DMTR and how you came to the knowledge of these gaps in our understanding of food systems.
Yeah, for me, it started off as a kind of an interest, I think, probably a good few years ago now, and around the start of COVID as well. I'd never specifically had somewhere that I was focused, and I kind of found myself thinking about, okay, if there was one thing that I wanted to focus on, educate myself on, and see where I could, potentially get involved with and get others and friends and family and hopefully others more involved with, what would it be? And the answer I came to for myself was hunger around the world. And the reason for that was, I guess, to me, the idea of the concept of hunger and the basis is the problem of hunger is not one of production, it's one of access. And what that really means is we produce enough food to feed everyone sufficiently around the world. But we fail to do so because of the man-made systems we have created for the way we produce and distribute that food and provide access to everyone. So to me, it's a largely, although we are solving for it by producing enough food, the hunger levels that we see today, only to me, seems like a man-made problem. And then in theory, it's like, well, then we can fix it. It's a simple problem to solve. It's obviously not. It's a huge conversation. There's so many aspects to it and various different ways that people are looking to tackle it. And most of them are absolutely needed. But that's was my very, very first thinking years ago now. But then the first steps that I took in terms of doing something was, okay, what can I do locally? And at the time I was living in London, and I started working at a local food bank in Bow to get more involved in the community, to help people more firsthand. And I think from that, in probably one of the most food secure countries in the world, obviously there are certain communities where, the problem is more severe than others. I was so shocked at the amount of food and cost that went through this one small food bank, who I think were running through £100,000 a month in food. They were supported by donations, but the majority of the actual food that they gave out, most of that was bought in, and often at reduced cost from supermarkets who supported them. But most of that was bought in, which meant massive costs. Like, my main role was often on the weekends dealing with food delivery, stacking shelves. And, we'd have this massive haul, which we'd fill up with food one Saturday, and we'd come back the next week 95% empty. And that was just in that one small community area within East London. This was being done. And I think for me, that just highlighted the scale of the problem. It put it very much front and center, and being able to connect to some people who were less food secure and struggling to always have a meal to eat within London, within the UK, as I mentioned, one of the more food secure countries in the world. And so just from that, I went to, one, this isn't a solution, right? A food bank is plugging a gap to help people where there is a problem, but it's not solving the problem. It is helping to deal with the problems we have, but it is not solving it. And it's just put into context for me just the massive scale of the problem we have. Other countries where food insecurity levels are so much higher and are suffering from problems like famine and lack of water supply, it's such a much bigger problem. And that pushed me to go, okay, I know very, very little about that. to be honest. I grew up in a city. I grew up in a country like the UK where the scale of the problem isn't nearly as severe as it is elsewhere. And that kind of highlights me, okay, I need to go figure out more, see really where this problem is coming from, because as amazing as the work the food banks are doing, they aren't going to be the answer to this, and we can't just continuously keep going and go, okay, we, at a local level, we need to plow loads of money in to fill the gap for those that just aren't receiving the support and don't have the network that they need to be able to put food on the plates. So from there, I decided to start a blog, mostly to educate myself, plus share with some interested friends. And through an insane amount of research, I think I spent most of my time, especially over COVID, it's the plus side of having some more free time being locked in at home. And basically, I spent a lot of time reading some of the latest research papers, some of the older ones as well, news articles and different publications from the FAO, so the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, the World Food Programme, and a number of other research institutes as well that focus on food security and looking to address that problem and highlighting where those issues are. And throughout that and throughout writing a blog over a couple of years, I think I always came back to a lot of the time, the same problem, and it highlighted the same problem continuously, which was where kind of the ideas for DMTR started coming from. Didn't have a name at the time, wasn't necessarily even going to be a standalone product in its own right, but what that kept highlighting is you've got food banks, which is localized. The problem's already there. We need to try and put money into to help those that are struggling. Then you've got the more humanitarian responses to disasters in areas where it is a major problem right now. And we need to obviously doing a lot to support people that don't yet have access to food, either displaced or struggling from in the aftermath of either a conflict, a natural disaster. That has meant that there's been a severe spike in food insecurity in a particular region in a particular period of time. But then looking longer term, what it then highlighted outside of that is the investment and the funding for solutions that looked longer term for this problem significantly lacked behind everywhere else. And whilst we're seeing a rise at the moment, it still lags massively behind other areas, other industries. And as I mentioned earlier, in terms of some of the rationale behind DMTR's mission, a lot of it is going to places where actually it's driven behind pushing agriculture to the next level, improving efficiency in terms of how we're producing food. But as we mentioned, a lot of the problem is around access. So we can continue to grow the amount of food or increase the amount of food we're producing. But if we're not putting funding and support behind solutions that are actually helping the communities that are struggling the most, which we are clearly not doing enough and not nearly at the scale that's been done, then we're not going to solve the problem. We're just going to continue in this cycle where it continues to grow. It continues to be 1 in 10. And hopefully we can get that down even with current trends. But that's where highlighted from all that research and this blog post for me was like just a very obvious statement of, okay, that's where more definitely needs to be done, and it'd be good to do something about it. Now, my assumption at the time had been, okay, cool. I now know a bit more because I've spent some time learning. I don't work in the industry. I don't work for charity. And my initial thoughts were, okay, there must be many other organizations out there already doing it. How can I help them? And the other thing was, okay, those people are actually working full time in either a corporate that is heavily involved in food or in charities that are either locally involved in food or within regions. They'll understand this stuff and they'll know this all, and people will be looking at, etc. A couple of years, probably a year and a half ago now, I went to a big industry event which brought together a number of non-profits, a number of big food companies like Unilever, Sodexo, where based on what I just said, I expected to be 99% listening, right, and learning. And because that was my expectation, I was like, I'm going to go in, I'm going to know the least about the topic and the problem as a whole. And I'm just really there to listen, learn, see what others are doing, see what others know. And I surprised myself, but I think I probably spent about 80% of my time actually bringing others up to speed who work closely with food distribution, food access, either from a charitable angle or as a foundational arm of some of the big food companies that are out there. And from that, I thought, maybe there is value to this. If those people working this closely to it were still very, very unaware, because, it's written in 50-page documents that are published by research papers, and bringing that together with what's happening on the ground, you can appreciate how it does become hard to stay up to speed with a lot of the stuff, especially as it changes so rapidly. So yeah, I thought, maybe there is value to this, and that's where DMTR ultimately came from. I looked to see what are the other organizations doing in this space. And surprisingly, there are very, very few with this specific core focus. There are many larger organizations out there which have a breadth of focus, from the humanitarian to the broader foundations, who have got a general aim to help food security and to reduce hunger around the world. But very few with a very specific and distinct focus around, okay, we need to look to push and inspire people who are looking at localized solutions that are leveraging some of the latest new tech and old tech. And innovation doesn't have to rely on AI. It can leverage something that's been around for years and years and years, but do it in a new way that makes it work for a community that maybe doesn't have access in the same way that other communities do to something that's been around for a long, long time. And that's where we want to focus. And hence we decided to go down our own path to really push that as a goal, as a mission. And that's how we ended up here today.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm learning by doing this. And I guess if I could ask, why do you think there is this fragmentation of knowledge or this blind spot in the sector? And if that information is, I guess you said it's challenging to find because it might be buried in a lot of academic knowledge, but still, it's clearly surprising to you, and it's, I'm sure, surprising for a lot of the listeners as well to realize this is the state of things. Why do you think this isn't more common knowledge?
I think one of the biggest things and one of the biggest challenges is data. So it's extremely difficult to track where money is going, how effective it's being. A lot of the problem with a lot of this is that a lot of the areas that struggle are particularly communities that often it's not just food they lack access to, right? It's challenging to come to a consensus on, this is the right way to deal with this. And we've got this problem, and we know that if we do this specific thing, we've proved that this works and we should be doing more and more of this. Now, because that doesn't exist, and there are efforts being made now to improve that, and I think we're starting to see that now more and more, as something we need to push more and more to actually start saying, okay, how do we create data points across the entire agri-food system that allows us to actually see what's working, what's not, and come to a consensus around, okay, this is the right and effective way to deal with this. Now, the reality is it is fragmented, and it's fragmented because it differs by country, because there are so many moving parts with all of this. We haven't touched on it, but government policy is a massive part of how effective any solution can be, and that will obviously vary country to country. So I think it's a mixture of factors, those being some, and then the point I touched on before, and you flagged specifically around, there is a lot of literature around this. There's also a lot of people with the experience and on the ground presence, and often it's very difficult to bring all of that together. It's a lot to digest in terms of some of these longer, more detailed research reports, and often they're very, very specific, right? One solution for how to get rice to be most effectively produced in certain regions or individual areas within a country so that the people there have better access and rely less on imports into the area is a very specific topic. And I think that's a large part of the challenge, is that the solutions are all very, and I used the word earlier that we want to focus on localized solutions, because the solutions are localized. Different communities, depending on where they are, that don't always struggle from the same problems, and the solutions aren't the same. And it just means that the pure mass of information out there and different lines of thinking is massive. And it's a lot of noise to try and navigate through, to try and work out actually what's working. And the reality is there's so much noise because it's so difficult to demonstrate and show what is, because up until now, and even still now, right, we just don't have necessarily the data to show this is how things are going. I mean, case in point, 2022, because that was the last point that realistically we were able to estimate hunger levels to a good degree of accuracy, because it's so difficult to do. It's such a broad scale problem that affects communities around the world that means that it is just challenging. I mean, I touched on the blog stuff earlier, and it's not lost on me that that's probably touched at the tip of an iceberg of information and areas that will need to be worked on and focused on. It is ultimately complex and it's a lot to digest. So point is to try and break all of that down. We've obviously formed a view, and the whole point with MTR was like, it is a massive topic, right? And if we were to attempt to tackle the whole thing and go, right, these are the different aspects of hunger, these are the different ways that we dealing with the problem now, the short term, the medium term, the long term, and we've gone, okay, look, we're going to try and focus on how we can do things in the medium term and focus it down a bit to try and start to make some of that a bit more digestible, a bit more understandable. Because quite frankly, I think if you don't, it's just so much to comprehend and get your head around. I personally can't imagine how any single human being could possibly do that with the whole topic, because it is such a massive problem and it is at such a big scale that it needs to be broken down to really comprehend and to deal with. So maybe I feel like I spoke for a while there. So maybe I'll take a little break. But I think I flagged earlier that from what I went through, maybe my route into this was not so conventional. It's not an area I actually worked in, and was ultimately more sparked from an interest that turned into a passion and something that I wanted to be able to do something more about. But knowing your background a bit more than people listening to, I feel yours, Dion, has probably been one far more consistent in the world of food and food security, really, since university, working with humanitarian and philanthropic organizations. So for me, and hopefully for others, what would be interesting to know is how do you actually get into an experience or an area like that, and where did your journey with food and malnutrition ultimately first start, and how did you find yourself coming here?
Yeah, I guess superficially there may be differences in our journey, but I think at its core the genesis is similar, right? And I think the way you summarized in the last point, that there is this immense complexity to our food systems and some very obvious problems that seemingly obvious, but I was not aware of. That realization kind of drew me closer and closer to the subject. But to put that practically, I guess I was always aware that I wanted to work in developmental or humanitarian contexts, so that's what I did. And I started in disaster response capacities. And within that, I was supporting a few missions and then also sent on a couple acute disaster response missions. Being on the ground and closer to that topic, I think you realize the necessity of a deeper understanding of our food system, because you're acutely aware of how broken it is. For example, in Indonesia, in Sulawesi Island, after the earthquake in 2018, there was a huge number of deaths from the disaster itself, but then there is an aftermath to the disaster that often also has deadly consequences in terms of how this damages our food chains and food systems and wash as well, so water, sanitation, hygiene capacities. So I think it's just within that humanitarian focus, I had more and more of these experiences that really painted that picture of quite how severe these problems are in our food system. And I then had this opportunity to work with the World Food Programme in Kenya. And while there, COVID struck and the restriction measures related to the pandemic had huge consequences for the food systems in Kenya and in East Africa as a whole. And we were involved in, to your point earlier, trying to put together disparate data sources and dynamic market monitoring, etc., to understand what is happening in the food system and understand the severity of those consequences for food insecurity and hunger, malnutrition. At that time, something that really catalyzed a sense of urgency again for me was how little we knew about urban food insecurity. So COVID had, in a way, disproportionate effects on urban environments because it affected people's livelihoods so severely. And yeah, that this whole point about our food system having severe problems with food access as opposed to food production, our food supply, was made obvious through the immense food insecurity that developed in urban settings during COVID-19. So part of my role there was to try to unpack that, to understand what is the state of food insecurity or security in urban settings. I did my master's thesis on this, and I found it fascinating that something which is clearly already a problem, yes, perhaps exacerbated by COVID-19, but is also clearly going to evolve as a problem over the coming decades, we knew so little about. And even the World Food Programme, who do tremendous work, but had a blind spot, self-admitted blind spot when it came to urban food insecurity. So I think I, much like you, had this sense that there was a lot of unknown within studies of food security. And there were these wonderful academic papers that would piece some of this puzzle together, but there was ultimately just so much to know and such a latency in how that information is digested and all of this political developmental context surrounding it that means that our humanitarian system is not always responding in the most efficient and effective way. And if that's our humanitarian system, what about when you include corporate interest, for-profit interest as well? Our food system as a whole needs some love and attention. So yeah, I think that's what brought me to my interest in this topic as a whole, and that's what brought us to having continuing conversations around your work with the MTR.
Nice. Yeah, you got in earlier than I did. My quantum physics university background is not quite the same.
But I didn't know that's what you studied, actually.
Yeah. I didn't.
Wow.
I didn't.
I've got some questions for you.
How do you go from that to this? Is that one? Yeah.
I'm sure that's something.
Yeah. I did maths and physics at university and mainly focused on quantum physics in my final year. But then I was like, no, let's not do that. Let's not do that anymore.
So we've talked a bit about DMTR and our personal journeys, but maybe let's just hit it home. Why exactly are we here? How did this podcast come to be? And what role do you see this podcast playing for the broader fight against world hunger and the mandate of DMTR?
So I think we've probably covered plenty about the problem and why it needs solving, and that should be apparent to everyone. So I'm not going to repeat that again. But I think, in my view, really, we're two guys who believe everyone has the right to have access to food and to never have to go hungry. So as part of DMTR and through this podcast/vodcast or whatever it's called these days, we believe that we can play our part in achieving that through educating on the challenges and amazing innovations that are breaking down inequality in the way food is both produced and, more importantly, accessed, all whilst driving us towards a more sustainable future for the world's food system. And as I said before, hopefully we might even inspire some innovators in waiting out there along the way. And maybe to that point, and why don't we round off this episode with some of the main things that we've learned so far in our journeys. And for this, maybe Dion, I'll come to you as the final question, so no pressure. So you've had quite a wide range of experiences, point efforts to reduce hunger around the world that you've touched on quite a few of those in the last half hour or so, from research on the ground work with humanitarian organizations, as well as the funding side of things, working in philanthropy as well. Through all of this, what's one thing that you've learned that has surprised you, if you were to pick one?
Tough question. Thank you for the responsibility.
No problem. You're welcome.
Yeah, no, it's hard to look past it, considering during this episode, I think we've talked about the holistic problem so many times, and in different ways we've highlighted that. But I think, again, to just really drill that home, that experience I had in Kenya and that misunderstanding or lack of understanding of urban food security is indicative of a wider problem of our response, and our global food system is still premised on an outdated idea of what food security means and what it entails, and ultimately what the problem is, right? So we still have a global food system that is built on the idea that the main problem that we face as a society in achieving food security is a lack of food supply. It's production oriented. It's got this severe productivist bias that permeates through, I think, a lot of humanitarian developmental programming, but also in the agricultural industry as a whole. For some reason, it makes sense that this is the easiest solution to focus on, at least superficially. But we can see, especially with the data we've talked about since 2015, that it's not enough and it's not working. And a real, meaningful, sustainable solution has to come from somewhere else. So I guess I'm always surprised how much there is still to learn, how difficult it is to have sufficient data to draw meaningful conclusions, as you highlighted earlier, and how fragmented this knowledge is. So ultimately, that's why we're here, and I hope we can play some part in leveling that gap.
See, there was no pressure at all. You answered that way better than I could have done. So that's a wrap for this episode. Join us next time as we break down some of the latest developments from the world of food and agricultural technology and explore how technological innovation in Southeast Asia is changing the livelihoods of some of the most food insecure people in the region. Thanks, and see you next time.